I want to welcome our panelists for a discussion on our first panel on perspectives on data management and sharing across different data types. We've assembled an outstanding group: ATUL BUTTE from UCSF, LARA MANGRAVITE from Sage Bionetworks, Alexander ROPELEWSKI from Brain Image Library, and Joshua Wallach from the Yale School of Public Health. And these panelists were asked to weigh in on 3 questions to provide brief remarks. First, if data sharing is the means, what are the end goals? What do you see as the biggest challenges to implementing the NIH data sharing policy across different types of data? And from your perspective, what will successful data sharing look like after the implementation of the NIH policy? So I first want to invite ATUL, Lara, and Josh to weigh in on the first question. If data sharing is the means, what are the end goals? ATUL?
Great, thanks for having me and inviting me onto this panel. So first of all, it's great to see that the data sharing guidance and standards and needs and mandates from NIH and other funding agencies are going to keep increasing. I love that. But if data sharing is the means, what is the end goal? To me, there has to be a visible reason why the data sharing is actually yielding something. So it's obviously one thing to share data from large funded consortia, like ENCODE, like the Human Genome Project, like GTEx, like many others. Of course, those folks go in knowing they have to share their data. The next harder mile to traverse is going to be to get more useful and usable data from individual labs, individual program project grants, and convincing them beyond mandating them, actually convincing them is going to need to be done using real goals. So in my opinion, just going after reproducibility and verification are not enough. Those are weaker arguments to me for data sharing. Very few experiments actually have any public attempt to actually be reproduced. And merely sharing data isn't enough to verify experimental results, as anyone who's seen fraudulent data probably would agree to. To me, it's got to be about real downstream use. So science building on data, science starting from data. I recently put out a paper, and I'll put it in the link, on 11 reasons why we need to promote data sharing, specifically clinical trials data sharing. And yeah, of course, the paper starts with reproducibility, verification, trust, believability, but other reasons, new science. I love it when I can start to see papers using from the Cancer Genome Atlas. You know, I talk about a paper all the time. Nature genetics papers now start by saying we downloaded data. To me, that's the future. We need to have more people using data sets to launch their scientific projects. Learning from failures. I think failed experimental data should be out there. So that just helps all of us get to something that actually works and some real science. Faster reporting of results benefits the participants as well as the investigators. Empowering participants themselves to take this experimental data and to help themselves and their communities. And then, of course, enabling learning, so students to see these data sets. For some graduate students, the public data sets might be the only time they see single-cell RNA-seq or CyTOF data because it's public. Backing public policies, I think any major public policy that comes out of science should have that data behind it be public. And then launching new ventures, including companies, entrepreneurship, and all the rest. So I think those are real downstream uses beyond just reproducibility. And let me turn it over to my colleagues here.
Thank you. Lara?
Yeah, that was great. Call to action ATUL. It was a wonderful way to start. Sage Bionetworks, right, we started 12 years ago with this vision of open data sharing as a way to accelerate research. And where we're standing right now after 12 years in the field is we're involved in, I'd estimate, around 50 different projects where we act as the data steward for data sharing. And that includes with, I think, 6 of the institutes at the NIH. And so what I can give you is a perspective on what I've seen as effective and not, right? And it really is about this question, which ATUL so beautifully answered around, what are you going to do with the data once you've shared it? I'll continue to agree with ATUL that it's very clear what to do when the NIH or another funder is deciding to actually generate data and put it in the open domain as a public resource for many people to use. TCGA being the canonical example, all of us more recently. It's also pretty clear what the benefit of data sharing is for something like N3C, the National COVID Collaborative, National, I think I missed a C there, where you're aggregating data from multiple sources to be able to have enough of a pool of data to be able to use, and that also needs to be available as a public resource. That sort of concept very much came up in rare disease analyses, in particular rare disease genetics. And so we can see clear benefit of data sharing that really motivates the activities that go into the data sharing. I think that the policy that the NIH is putting out is really looking to focus on individual labs and expectations for them in terms of data sharing. And that becomes a little bit more complicated because how that data might be reused is a little bit more in question, I think. I do think transparency and reproducibility is a really important part of this. And although I agree with ATUL that it's not really the case that most data and methods are put out in such a way that you really could reproduce easily what anybody has done, I think the act of having to make your data and your algorithms open raises the bar for each individual researcher in terms of checking their work and making sure that they really attest to the research products that they're developing, and that is a really important part of this that shouldn't be underscored. However, having said that, if you really want the data to be fair, if you really want the data to be shared in a way that it could be reused, it has to be shared with an eye towards that reuse. And where I've seen this work really effectively across many projects, across many institutes, is in this concept of aggregating groups of investigators through a consortia or another sort of organizing principle where they have the opportunity to interact with each other, interact with other individuals who work in their field, who may be generating similar data or asking similar questions, because here you start to create a community of people who actually might be most interested in the data that you're collecting. And as you build that, that trust between individuals, you start to see the reuse happen, and it turns into actual benefits for each of the individuals, right? They may get collaborations out of it. These may actually result in additional papers or studies for them to do. But more importantly, I think what it does is it helps organize and orient each of the individuals around how it is their data actually needs to be curated and effectively shared to be reused by others. And it gives them the opportunity to see firsthand how that use happens. So I think that that's a wonderful organizing principle around many of the benefits that come out of data sharing, which are around independent evaluation of results and requiring benchmarking of methods and algorithms that are being used, and speeding the process of science in which we use data, evaluate each other's results, and collaborate towards coming up with some collective consensus about new discoveries. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Josh, let's move to you.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this important workshop and to be part of this panel. I kind of want to start by echoing what the others have already said so well. The end goal, I think we all agree upon, is about accelerating discovery, maximizing trust in science, and beyond that, even minimizing the potential redundancies of duplicative experimentation. And of course, we can minimize costs and maximize the contribution of human subjects by sharing the data from all different types of subject studies, including observational research. And as part of this, I want to talk a little bit about, what our end goals are and the success of some previous data sharing efforts to really highlight what we've already seen in terms of what end goals can look like. And over the past few, I guess it was really over the past decade, a number of high-profile clinical trial and clinical study data sharing platforms have already been launched. Through the NIH, there's the Biological Specimen and Data Repository Information Center, or BioLink. There's the Yale Open Data Access, clinicalstudydatarequest.com, Vivly. All of these platforms are already providing access to some clinical study information that's requestable by individuals who are interested in conducting secondary analyses, meta-analyses, analyses that are looking at verifying previous methodologies. And I recently worked on a study with a student here at Yale where we tried to understand what exactly is being done with the shared data. What type of studies, what are the objectives of individuals who are actually requesting data from these data sharing platforms? And we found that the majority of studies are actually looking at conducting new analyses, accelerating the type of, different type of outcomes and secondary analyses, and validating the methods that may be developed in previous studies. We also saw that although some of these platforms are relatively new, we're seeing, dissemination of this information into the scientific field. So about a quarter of these research requests are already resulting in publications or preprints or conference abstracts. And I think this is really highlighting the success of data sharing and the entire purpose of data sharing, allowing for this type of acceleration of knowledge and accumulation of evidence. And I think we've also seen great examples of secondary analyses that have had an impact on policy guidelines, clinical care. The New England Journal of Medicine, for example, had the Sprint Data Analysis Challenge, where they released data from the systolic blood pressure intervention trial. And one secondary analysis of the shared data found that there was an incorrectly calculated Framingham 10-year cardiovascular risk score regression model. So essentially updating what we already thought we knew. And there's other examples of data shared through the NIH, the digoxin versus placebo trial from the DIG trial group, where secondary analyses have found important differences, sex-based differences that were not initially observed in the study. So I think overall, these examples can highlight what we're actually striving for. What is the end goal? The end goal really is obviously the transparency, maximizing trust, but accelerating discovery through these important secondary analyses and accumulation of evidence.
Thank you. And I think obviously we could continue on this one topic forever, but it is I think we've heard some very hopeful examples. And also, again, I think a theme that's going to come up in the workshop of these large prospective data sets versus routine data sharing at the individual level. And there are a couple of questions of the audience, and if we have time at the end, I hope we'll be able to bring them up. But I think we want to touch on the other questions. So now, Alex, I want you to touch on what do you see as the biggest challenges to implementing the NIH data sharing policy across different types of data? We know that all data types are not equally easy, if you will, to share, and that they can represent some very specific challenges.
Thank you, Maryann, and thank the panelists and everyone for inviting me to talk today. I'm specifically, because we don't have that much time, I'm going to touch on 3 challenges with sharing large-scale microscopy data. And by large scale, I mean data sets that are tens of terabytes or larger. They could be hundreds of terabytes or petabyte data sets. And the biggest challenge that we face in sharing microscopy data really is data movement. And part of this is historical, because in the past, microscopy facilities have not been configured to facilitate exporting large amounts of data through the network. Personally, with the Brain Image Library, we've encountered barriers with microscopy facilities to include things such as inadequate bandwidth connections to wide area networks, network routing issues, and last mile, and most frequently the last mile local network limitations and policies that are instituted by the institution itself. And indeed, as microscopy labs lay plans to produce petabyte scale data sets within the next few years, this is going to indeed become an even more challenging problem. one of the ways that we've mitigated this in my archive, the Brain Image Library at the current time, is to receive data on LTO tapes as well as portable disks. Though ultimately, the best way to resolve these issues is through a concerted effort to locate and remove the barriers within the local network infrastructure. But these efforts are usually undertaken at the institutional level, and they are beyond the direct control of the data producing labs. So I think that's a consideration that labs that are producing the data may need to address before, or at least have a plan to address it before they produce the large amounts of data. A secondary challenge faced is the balance between storage cost and accessibility. Again, cold or tape storage is relatively cheap, but if somebody actually wants to use the data, the access times to retrieve large data sets from cold storage, it takes an awful long time. There are some commercial systems out there that can incorporate tiered storage strategies, but those systems work best for centralized facilities and at archive sites. And you know, I'm just going to throw this out here to speculate on how one might share future exabyte-sized data sets. You know, we might need to consider the data seasons concept that has been used by other fields, where complete large data sets are made available on fast storage for a scheduled period of time, and the rest of the time live on cold storage. So we're sharing the data, but there's sort of a season where that data gets shared on rapid disk. There are other challenges, including harmonizing data and metadata produced from several disconnected labs into common, usable, standardized formats. But an issue that I've seen is that while everyone agrees that standards would make it easier to reuse data from the user's perspective, there are often community disagreements and between community disagreements on what exactly those standards should be, what ontology should be used, and ultimately how easy or difficult it would be to incorporate those standards within an existing data ecosystem. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Alex. And again, I think it's important during this workshop that we constantly remember that all data are not equal and that the infrastructure for all data may not all be in the same state. So I think that was a very important point. Josh, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I'd be really happy to. I think Alexander commented on a number of important issues, and with the focus on microscopy data sharing. And I think I can say a little about observational study sharing and clinical sharing and clinical study sharing and some of the limitations there. I actually think for clinical trials and observational studies, or traditional observational studies, I think we're beyond the questions of where and how do we share the clinical data. I think, as we've seen from other data sharing repositories that are available, the technology and infrastructure have been developed. They've also been tested. We see successful sharing of, personal identifiable information from trial participants through these platforms. I think where the challenges, moving forward, even with the new policy, remain is that they rely on voluntary sharing of data, and there's no definitive mandate for data sharing. And compliance moving forward, I think, could be an issue. Empirical evidence does suggest that data sharing statements, or including data sharing statements at the journal levels, haven't really led to adherence to the actual sharing of the data themselves. So there's potentially not as much incentive to actually tie the sharing of data to the statements that data can and will be made available. So I think one of the items that will be a challenge moving forward is changing the culture of how do we go from a statement to actually sharing this information. And I think part of this is potentially researcher reluctance and improving and changing the incentive system. So if we think about observational research, where someone has spent years building up a cohort of individuals, the general expectation now is that there's a focus on accumulating papers and accumulating publications from these databases, from these cohort studies. And I think there's a need to change the incentive structure away from this potential individual focus on keeping the data, within a certain group and allowing this sharing of these. And one other item that I'll focus on is obviously there'll need to be some flexibility in terms of what can be shared. Certain observational studies we can imagine with claims data or using real world data, we can't actually expect sharing of this information. This is not something that's owned by the individual researcher who's conducting observational research using administrative claims data. So in these types of studies, we need to think about what does a data sharing statement actually mean. We need some type of information about where this comes from, the governance of this information, the infrastructure, the IRB process, and the storage. So there's obviously some flexibility that's going to be needed, but also some kind of carrot and stick for the sharing of data to change the current kind of culture of sharing and observational research.
Those are all excellent points. I really do wish we had time to explore a little bit longer, but I think that a lot of these themes will be picked up during the conference. And so I think that this is an excellent way to start it off. So in our last 8 minutes, let's turn to question 3. And I think this should be a fun question. From your perspective, what will successful data sharing look like after the implementation of the NIH data policy? And I'll start with you, ATUL, and I hope we can get to all the panelists on this.
Yeah, I'll answer this one quicker. Look, I run a repository called Import for NIAID. I wish successful data sharing looked like hit rates and download rates, but I believe from the NIH perspective, it really should be simply answering the question, is innovation happening from these data sets? And I'm going to use the word innovation rather than science, okay? Science is great for asking questions, but it could be engineering from these data sets. It could be entrepreneurship from these data sets. But I think it's up to us then to document how those data sets are being used for downstream innovation. Otherwise, hit rates and things are arbitrary. I would leave it at that.
LARA.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's really easy to message how many times somebody's downloaded a certain data set, but what are they doing with it and how is that impacting their downstream work? Is the really important thing, and I think, and honestly, it can be really hard to find metrics around that because a lot of that is a really long time period before you get to a public innovation. I wanted to take a different tact on this. If I think about what I'd really like as end goals of this policy. 2 other things come to mind beyond the impact this has on innovation in science. One is, I think, I would like to see one of the outcomes of this policy be a change in the incentive structure and in particular in the metrics we use to evaluate scientific career advancement. Within the institutions in which researchers reside. If this policy is going to be effective, it needs to impact the way we think about rewarding scientists. So I would look at that as a downstream metric of success for this policy. And the second thing that I think it can do, and I certainly hope it will do, is within the public, beyond scientists, to help to increase both scientific literacy and scientific trust. And so I would look to metrics around that as well.
Yes, I agree. Those are extremely important. Alex, do you want to weigh in?
Weigh in. I think there's been a mention, and I appreciate the input from the panelist here. But there was a mention on downloads and number of downloads and things along these lines. In our model, particularly with larger data sets, that's more of a less useful metric or measure than people are actually using the data. And I think that's sort of the general consensus here. But really, an essential component with large data sets is that there have to be effective computing resources associated with the data so that people can compute and do their analysis on the data without having to download it. It's really unrealistic to expect somebody's going to download a petabyte of data and do their local analysis on that data set and then publish some result from it. As far as metrics are concerned, I think tracking the impact through data set DOI citations in publications is probably the most useful metric, but it's a lagging indicator. And issuing DOIs is problematic for data sets that are being continually updated, or those data sets that are being made available to the community rapidly in a piecemeal fashion. So there's some issues that I think would need to be resolved there. And I'll stop here and give the other panelists some time to finish up.
Okay, Josh, I know you've weighed in on the first two, but I think this is a fun question. So do you want to spend some
Thanks
time?
for the opportunity, and I'll keep it short. I think part of what will successful data sharing look like is that one item is that the statements or the data sharing statements are not just statements. They're actually leading to the sharing of data. And I think success is also that it's not necessarily about checking a box or fulfilling an NIH requirement for data sharing, that it's actually a change in the culture, as been said before, and that the data are actually usable. So is the information out there in a way that can be used, leading to the secondary analyses that I've kind of mentioned before. So I think really a success would be that it's not just about checking a box, that the statements are not just statements, and that we're seeing an improved awareness and change in culture. So I think those are the successes that I would hope for.
Thank you, everyone. And since everyone was so succinct in their remarks, we actually can take a question from the audience, and trying to keep up with the conversation and the questions. But there's an interesting question about failed experiments. I think, ATUL, you brought that up in the beginning. And there's been a theme here of culture change. And typically, we don't like to share our failed experiments. And also, we tend to share them in the context of a paper. So I'm wondering if ATUL and others want to weigh in on how you think success would look like with failed experiments, right? How should they be treated?
That's a great question. I come up with the failed experiment one because, for example, we have a lot of biotech companies working in, so let me talk about clinical trials data for a second. We have a lot of biotech companies working, for example, on cellular therapies for cancer, CAR T cells and others. And it's been noticed several times that these big, expensive trials in well-funded companies fail, but then nothing is put out there. And so none of the communities, okay, you could call them competitors, but none of the other partners against cancer could learn from those failed experiments, right? I wish we had a culture that would incentivize that. And it's not a DOI that's gonna make that happen, okay? It has nothing to do with DOIs. Yes, they're great, we have them, we've had them now for a while. We gotta get to the next level of hitting people with a carrot, right? What is it that would convince a biotech company to share that valuable data? Hard problem.
It is a hard problem. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I'll weigh in.
Okay.
One of the things that I've seen working well, or starting to work well within the academic lab model, is the use of pre-registration requirements, because then this gets at least seeing what experiments are being run. There's more to be done to require or I guess change the culture to ensure that the pre-registration results in publication of results even when they're failed. But I think that that's a place that we could build on to this question.
Yeah, I actually think that's an excellent idea. So again, when we're talking about cultural change, we're talking about looking strategically at the infrastructure. But one thing that I really liked from this panel, again, was the metrics of clicks and downloads are important. We need to be able to count them. We need to be able to share them. But we don't want to let that overshadow, right, the excitement that can be generated in this sort of new phase where we share data, and trying to think of additional metrics and ways to track impact, innovation, not just in the academic space, but in the educational space, the commercial space. I think really is going to be a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity to really address another issue, which is educating the public on what happens with science, right? And why science is such a public good, because it can drive these things. So I want to thank the panelists for an excellent discussion. Again, I think every moderator is going to say we wish we had more time, but I think it was an excellent kickoff. And I'd like to introduce Elaine Martis, who's going to take us to session 1. Thank you, everyone.